Today, we're journeying back in time to the island of Jamaica, a jewel in the crown of the British Empire, but one with a deeply complex and often hidden history. While we might think of Jamaica for its stunning beaches and vibrant culture, its past under British rule is a story of immense wealth built on immense suffering. When the English captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, they saw its potential not just as a strategic outpost, but as a massive sugar factory. This white gold, as sugar was called, was the engine of the empire's economy, and Jamaica became its most profitable colony. But this immense wealth came at an unimaginable human cost. The sugar plantations were brutal, relying on the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. The conditions were horrific, and the system was designed to extract maximum profit, no matter the toll on human life. This dark chapter also gave rise to incredible stories of resistance. The Maroons, descendants of Africans who escaped slavery, established their own free communities in the island's mountainous interior. They fought fiercely against the British for their freedom, becoming a powerful symbol of defiance and resilience. Their struggle is a crucial part of Jamaica's story, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who refuse to be broken. Exploring this history helps us understand not just Jamaica today, but the very foundations of the modern world. The legacies of empire, both the grand structures and the deep scars, are still visible. It's a reminder that history is never really in the past. Chapter 1. The Empire's Hidden Island. When most people think of the British Empire, they picture red coats, tea, and London's foggy streets. But what if I told you the empire's real power, its economic engine, didn't come from Europe? It came from a small, sun-soaked island thousands of miles away, Jamaica. What looked like a Caribbean paradise was actually the empire's most profitable and most brutal machine. Every grain of sugar, every shipment of rum, every ounce of gold that filled British pockets, much of it started here, built on a foundation of immense suffering. Jamaica wasn't just another colony. It was the crown jewel, the heart of Britain's Caribbean network, an island that made kings and merchants unimaginably rich, powered by the stolen labor of enslaved Africans who never saw freedom. Behind this empire of wealth were secrets, rebellions, and voices the empire desperately tried to silence. And once you uncover what really happened here, you'll see why Jamaica wasn't just part of the British Empire. In many ways, it was the island that exposed its true nature. The story begins in 1655. The English, led by Oliver Cromwell's forces, seized Jamaica from the Spanish. They weren't just looking for land, they were looking for profit. And they found it in white gold, sugar. The island's fertile soil and tropical climate were perfect for sugarcane cultivation. But sugar production was incredibly labor-intensive. To make this venture profitable, the British turned to the transatlantic slave trade on a scale never seen before. Hundreds of thousands of Africans were forcibly brought to Jamaica, stripped of their names, their freedom, and their humanity, all to work on sprawling sugar plantations under the most horrific conditions. Life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Jamaican sugar plantation was often less than 10 years. This system created a society built on a terrifying paradox. Jamaica became the richest colony in the British Empire. Port Royal, and later Kingston, became bustling hubs of commerce, where immense fortunes were made. The wealth generated from Jamaican sugar funded Britain's Industrial Revolution, built grand country estates, and financed its powerful navy. But this prosperity was built directly on the backs of enslaved people. The plantation owners lived in luxury, while the majority of the island's population lived in bondage, subject to brutal punishments and relentless work. The sweet tea enjoyed in London drawing rooms had a bitter human cost. The sheer scale of this operation is staggering. By the 18th century, tiny Jamaica was producing more sugar than all of the other British colonies combined. But where there is oppression, there is always resistance. The British Empire could control the land, but it could never completely crush the human spirit. From the very beginning, enslaved people fought back. Many escaped the brutal plantations and fled into the island's remote mountainous interior. There, they formed their own free communities. These were the Maroons. The word maroon comes from the Spanish word chimarrón, meaning wild or untamed. And they lived up to that name. Led by brilliant military and spiritual leaders like Queen Nanny, the Maroons waged a relentless guerrilla war against the British for decades. They used their deep knowledge of the island's terrain to their advantage, staging raids, freeing other enslaved people, and creating a constant thorn in the side of the colonial government. Queen Nanny in particular is a legendary figure. She was a master strategist and a spiritual leader who inspired her people to fight for their freedom. The British military, one of the most powerful in the world, could not defeat them. Eventually, in 1739, the British were forced to sign a peace treaty with the Maroons, granting them autonomy and land. It was a stunning victory, a testament to their resilience and courage. The Maroons had carved out their own freedom right in the heart of the Empire's most valuable asset. The Maroon Wars were just the beginning. The spirit of rebellion was always simmering just beneath the surface. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw numerous uprisings across the island, culminating in the largest slave revolt in Jamaican history, the Baptist War of 1831, led by Samuel Sharp. Sharp was a literate, articulate Baptist deacon who used his position to organize a peaceful general strike. The plan was simple: refuse to work after the Christmas holidays unless they were paid wages. But the planters panicked, and the strike quickly escalated into a full-blown rebellion. The colonial authorities responded with overwhelming force. The revolt was brutally crushed, and Sam Sharp was executed. But his final words were powerful: "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." The Baptist War sent shockwaves all the way to London. The sheer scale of the rebellion and the immense cost of suppressing it made many in Britain question the economic and moral viability of slavery. Sam Sharp's sacrifice was not in vain. His rebellion was a major catalyst that pushed the British Parliament to pass the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. Freedom, when it finally came, wasn't a gift. It was won through centuries of resistance, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will to be free. Jamaica's story is a crucial, often overlooked chapter of British history. It reveals the true source of the empire's wealth and the profound human cost at which it was acquired. But more than that, it's a powerful story of resilience and the enduring fight for freedom against impossible odds. Chapter 2. How Sugar Built Britain's Fortune. In the 1700s, sugar wasn't just sweet, it was white gold, and Jamaica was its biggest producer in the world. Every ship that left Kingston carried more than cargo. It carried the wealth of an empire. This sugar route fueled Britain's economy, its factories, even its wars. While British aristocrats sipped sweetened tea and feasted on lavish desserts, thousands of enslaved Africans toiled under the burning Jamaican sun. For every teaspoon of sugar savored in London, a terrible price was paid in human suffering. This was the dark truth behind the sweetness. Endless hours in the fields, the crack of the whip, the constant threat of violence, all for a luxury the workers would never taste. Plantation owners became millionaires almost overnight. Banks in London, like Barclays and Lloyds, thrived on the profits generated by this brutal system. The British Empire grew fatter and more powerful with every harvest, its foundations built on the backs of the enslaved. This wasn't just commerce. It was a machine that turned human lives into profit. The numbers in the ledgers soared, showing immense wealth in pounds sterling. But they hid the immeasurable human cost. The rich got richer, creating a cycle of dependency where the empire's prosperity was directly tied to the exploitation of others. We look at a rusted sugar mill, a relic of a bygone era, and see a British gold coin, a symbol of the wealth it generated. It raises a chilling question. What happens when the wealth of an empire depends on pain? The sugar fields of Jamaica were more than just the backbone of Britain's economy. They were a ticking time bomb. The extreme cruelty and the vast profits it generated created a system so unjust that it couldn't last forever. The very suffering that built the empire would eventually plant the seeds of its undoing. The fight for freedom was brewing. And the story of sugar is also the story of resistance. Join us as we continue to uncover this complex and often brutal history. We'll explore the lives of those who endured and fought back against this system. This is a story that needs to be told, a past that must be understood to make sense of our present. Let's move to the next episode. Chapter 3: The Brutal Life of the Enslaved. Life on a Jamaican plantation wasn't life at all. It was a brutal test of survival. Imagine being torn from your home in Africa, your identity, your language, and even your name stripped away, only to be reduced to property, a mere entry in a ledger. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of people. The day began before the sun even thought about rising, shrouded in the morning mist over the vast sugarcane fields. But this peaceful image was shattered by the harsh, metallic clinking of chains and the relentless sound of machetes hacking at the cane. It was back-breaking labor from dawn until long after dusk, under the scorching Caribbean sun. Cutting cane, hauling crushing loads, and burning fields in intense heat. The work was endless, and the body was pushed to its absolute limit. Rest was a luxury rarely afforded, and punishment was a public spectacle, designed to instill fear and crush the human spirit. The whip was the overseer's primary tool, and the scars it left were a permanent reminder of the system's cruelty. The British Empire called this necessary labor to sweeten their tea and line their pockets. They built an entire economy on the agony of others. Every person was assigned a monetary value, their suffering meticulously recorded alongside sugar profits as if they were no different from livestock or equipment. It was a cold, calculated business of human misery. Yet even in this darkest corner of the empire, the flame of the human spirit refused to be extinguished. Resistance was not always loud. Sometimes it was a whisper. It lived in the songs they sang, which carried coded messages of hope and escape plans, their melodies floating over the fields like secret prayers. It lived in the stories they told their children, keeping the memory of their heritage alive. They plotted in hushed tones under the blanket of the night sky, their dreams of freedom a shared secret that bound them together. This dream was a powerful force, a slow-burning fire that would eventually grow strong enough to shake the very foundations of the British Empire. Because when people have nothing left to lose, they find a courage they never knew they had, a courage powerful enough to rise up and change the course of history. The whispers would soon become a roar, a call for freedom that could no longer be ignored. Let's move to the next chapter. Chapter 4. The rebellions that shook the empire. For over a century, the British Empire held Jamaica in its grip, a rule built on the sweat of the enslaved and enforced with relentless fear. But fear, like any chain, can only be stretched so far before it snaps. And in the oppressive heat of the Caribbean, anger ignites with terrifying speed. The story of the British Empire is often told from the perspective of its kings and queens, its generals and governors. But the real story, the one that truly defined its limits, was written in fire and blood by those it tried to crush. It all started with whispers, secrets exchanged in the dead of night between the rows of sugarcane, whispers that soon turned into a roar of defiance. In 1760, an Akan man known as Taki, who had been a chief in Africa before his capture, orchestrated one of the most significant and widespread slave revolts the British Caribbean had ever seen. He wasn't just fighting to escape, he was fighting to create a new, free black state in the mountains of Jamaica. The rebellion exploded across the parish of St. Mary. Plantations, the symbols of their oppression, were set ablaze, the night sky glowing red with the fires of liberation. Overseers who had ruled with the whip fled for their lives. For a breathtaking, chaotic moment, the enslaved seized control, fighting to reclaim the one thing that had been stolen from them: their humanity. The British colonial authorities, stunned by the scale and organization of the revolt, called it the Taki War. They saw it as a savage uprising, a chaotic outburst of violence. But for Taki and his thousands of followers, this was no mere riot. It was a revolutionary war, a desperate, brilliant campaign for freedom. They used their knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla tactics learned in their African homelands, and an unshakable will to fight back against a global superpower. The empire responded with overwhelming military force. The war was brutal, a bloody struggle that raged for months. In the end, Taki was killed, and the rebellion was savagely suppressed. The reprisals were horrific, designed to terrorize anyone who might ever dream of freedom again. But the fear they intended to sow had an unintended effect. It planted a seed. The memory of Taki's war became a legend, a story whispered from one generation of the enslaved to the next, a reminder that the chains could be challenged. Decades passed, but that seed of rebellion never died. It was nurtured in secret, in the very places the masters thought they had control. This time, the spark wasn't a warrior, but a preacher. Samuel Sharp, a self-educated deacon in the Baptist church, believed that freedom was a God-given right. He used the Bible not as a tool of submission, as the planters intended, but as a charter of liberation. He preached that no man had the right to own another in the eyes of God. In 1831, his words ignited the largest slave revolt in Jamaican history, the Baptist War. What began as a plan for a peaceful general strike on Christmas Day, a refusal to work until wages were paid, spiraled into a massive armed rebellion. 60,000 enslaved Jamaicans rose up, their conviction as powerful as any weapon. They were fighting not just for their bodies, but for their souls. The sound of gavels and outraged debate mixes with the distant sound of church bells. Once again, the empire's response was swift and merciless. The rebellion was crushed. Sam Sharp was captured and, before his execution, famously said, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." Over 200 rebels were executed, and thousands more were brutally punished. But this time was different. This time, the world was paying attention. News of the Baptist War and the brutal suppression that followed reached London. Abolitionist societies seized on the story, plastering newspapers with accounts of the planters' cruelty and the enslaved's heroic struggle for freedom. For the first time, ordinary people across Britain, people who sweetened their tea with sugar from Jamaican plantations, were forced to confront the sickening reality of the system. How could an empire that prided itself on Christian values and the rule of law defend the barbarity of slavery? The question became impossible to ignore. Then, 1834, slavery formally abolished in most of the British Empire. These monumental revolts in Jamaica did more than just shake a single island. They sent tremors right to the heart of the British Empire. They exposed the deep moral hypocrisy at its core. Taki's War showed the planters that their control was fragile. The Baptist War shattered the moral argument for slavery itself. The resistance of these brave men and women forced a conversation that the powerful could no longer avoid. While the Emancipation Act was a complex political process, it's undeniable that the relentless, courageous, and bloody fight for freedom in Jamaica cracked the empire's foundation. And once that foundation was cracked, nothing could ever be the same again. The age of absolute imperial dominance had begun its long, slow decline. Thank you so much for watching. These are the stories that are often left out of the history books, but they are crucial to understanding our world today. Let's move on to next chapter. Chapter 5. The Collapse of Britain's Caribbean Power. Imagine the Caribbean in the mid-19th century. The Union Jack, once a symbol of immense power, now flutters over an empire in retreat. For centuries, islands like Jamaica were the crown jewels of the British Empire, their value measured in tons of sugar cultivated through the brutal exploitation of enslaved people. The sugar plantations were the engine of British wealth, making a small elite fantastically rich while costing millions of lives and untold suffering. This was Britain's golden age in the Caribbean, a period built on a foundation of human misery. But tides, both literal and metaphorical, have a way of turning. The abolition of slavery in 1834 was a monumental step for humanity, but for the British Empire's economic model in the Caribbean, it was a cataclysm. Without the free labor they had relied on for generations, the massive sugar plantations, once churning out incredible profits, began to hemorrhage money. The entire system was designed around exploitation, and without it, the model collapsed. Plantation owners, who had grown accustomed to lavish lifestyles funded by human bondage, saw their fortunes evaporate. What was their response? Did they adapt? Did they invest in new technologies or fairer labor practices? For the most part, no. Instead, they packed their bags and abandoned the very lands they had stripped of resources and people. They fled back to England, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a population of newly freed individuals to fend for themselves. The once bustling docks of Kingston grew quiet. The machinery in the sugar mills rusted and seized. The grand plantation houses fell into disrepair, haunted by the ghosts of a cruel past. Jamaica, once the glittering prize of the empire, was suddenly an afterthought. Britain, ever the pragmatist when it came to profit, simply turned its gaze elsewhere. The imperial machine, always hungry, shifted its focus towards new territories, new resources, and new peoples to exploit. The attention and investment that once flowed to the Caribbean were redirected to India, with its vast markets and resources, and to the scramble for Africa, where new colonial ventures promised fresh fortunes. On maps of global trade, you could literally see the shipping lanes rerouting, bypassing the islands that had built the empire's wealth. The Caribbean was left behind, a relic of a previous era of colonial ambition. For the people of Jamaica and the wider Caribbean, this was a profound betrayal. They were left to rebuild their societies from the ashes of slavery, with no support, no reparations, and no justice for the centuries of stolen labor and lives. They were granted freedom, but denied the means to make that freedom meaningful. Yet, in the face of this abandonment, something remarkable happened. Freed Jamaicans didn't just survive. They began to build new communities, new economies, and a new identity. They cultivated their own small plots of land, formed mutual aid societies, and kept their cultural traditions alive, traditions that the empire had tried so hard to erase. Meanwhile, the British Empire engaged in a massive rebranding exercise. They tried to rewrite history, framing their colonial project not as one of violent extraction and exploitation, but as a civilizing mission. They portrayed themselves as benevolent rulers who had brought progress, law, and order to backward peoples. The brutal reality of slavery was downplayed, glossed over, or ignored entirely. But this narrative, this imperial propaganda, couldn't hold. The truth, buried under layers of official histories and self-congratulatory monuments, had a way of surfacing. The scars on the landscape and the memories of the people told a different story. Though the British flag continued to fly over Jamaica for another century, the foundation of its power had crumbled. The economic justification was gone, and the moral authority, always a fiction, was being challenged more and more vocally. The empire that had ruled through brute force and fear was now finding itself ruled by the unstoppable forces of history. The waves of change were crashing against its shores, and this time they could not be held back. In the quiet that followed the collapse of the sugar economy, in the space created by imperial neglect, Jamaica and other Caribbean nations began to find something Britain had never intended for them to have: a voice. A voice that would grow louder and louder, demanding not just freedom, but true independence and self-determination. This story is far from over, and its legacy continues to shape our world today. Chapter 6. The hidden legacy that still echoes today. Have you ever wondered what happens after an empire falls? Does it just vanish, leaving nothing but stories in history books? Or does it leave behind echoes, ripples that continue to shape the world long after the flags have been lowered? Today, we're journeying to the heart of the Caribbean, to Jamaica, to uncover a story of empire, resistance, and a legacy that is very much alive. Centuries ago, these hills and valleys told a story written in sugarcane and sweat. The British Empire carved its ambitions into this land, creating a system built on forced labor that produced immense wealth. But for the people brought here in chains, it was a world of unimaginable hardship. Yet, even in the darkest of times, the seeds of resistance were being sown. This isn't just a story about oppression, it's a story about the unshakable human spirit. It started with whispers in the dead of night, then grew into organized revolts. Figures like Queen Nanny of the Maroons, a brilliant military strategist, established free communities in the mountains, fighting off the British for decades. Then there was Tacky's War, one of the most significant uprisings in the 18th century British Empire. And later, Sam Sharpe's peaceful protest, which escalated into the Baptist War, a crucial event that accelerated the abolition of slavery across the entire empire. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were a constant, powerful declaration: we will be free. Even after emancipation in 1834, the struggle was far from over. The colonial system remained, controlling the economy, the laws, and even the landscape. Look around modern Jamaica, and you'll see the empire's ghost everywhere. In the names of towns like Mandeville and Savannah Lamar, in the legal and educational systems, which still bear the imprint of British design. Even in the language people speak, a vibrant patois, born from a fusion of African languages and English, a linguistic act of both adaptation and defiance. The British never truly left. Their influence is woven into the very fabric of the island. But just as the empire left its mark, so did the spirit of resistance. And this is where Jamaica's story becomes truly extraordinary. What began as cries for freedom in the cane fields transformed into a culture, a rhythm, a global voice. The pain of the past wasn't buried. It was channeled into something new, something powerful. Then, cut to colorful murals depicting national heroes like Marcus Garvey and Paul Bogle. This is the alchemy of Jamaican culture. Taking the raw materials of history, the hardship, the struggle, the injustice, and forging them into art, music, and an unshakable sense of identity. Think of reggae music. It's more than just a beat. It's a social commentary, a spiritual movement, and a message of liberation that resonated far beyond Jamaica's shores. When Bob Marley sang, the world listened. His songs carried the story of his ancestors, the philosophy of Rastafari, and the universal cry for justice and human rights. He took the specific experience of post-colonial Jamaica and made it a global anthem for the oppressed everywhere. From the struggle against apartheid in South Africa to civil rights movements in the United States, Jamaica's voice of resistance became a source of inspiration. This cultural revolution culminated in political freedom. In 1962, Jamaica gained its independence. But the story doesn't end there. The legacy of empire is complex. It left behind economic structures and global trade relationships that continue to create challenges, but it also left behind a people who learned how to turn scars into strength. Every empire leaves ghosts, but it is always up to the living to decide what to do with them. History doesn't just disappear, it transforms. In Jamaica, the brutal legacy of empire was met with a resilience so profound that it created something far more enduring, a unique, powerful, and proud identity that continues to influence the world today. Chapter 7. Jamaica's True Place in Empire. History. When we think of the British Empire, our minds often jump to grand narratives of London, India, or the 13 colonies. We picture powerful monarchs, vast armies, and a global trade network that spanned the entire planet. But what if I told you that a small island in the Caribbean holds the key to understanding the empire's very core, its immense wealth, its moral contradictions, and its ultimate decline? That island is Jamaica. To understand Jamaica's pivotal role, we have to start with one word: sugar. In the 17th and 18th centuries, sugar was not just a sweetener, it was white gold. It was the oil of its day, a commodity so valuable that it fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And Jamaica was the world's leading producer. The island became the crown jewel of the British Empire, a sugar-producing machine that generated staggering fortunes for a select few. The wealth extracted from Jamaican plantations was so immense that it financed banks, funded estates, and even influenced British politics back in London. The empire, in many ways, was built on a foundation of Jamaican sugar. But this wealth came at an unimaginable human cost. The sugar industry was brutally dependent on the transatlantic slave trade. Hundreds of thousands of Africans were forcibly brought to Jamaica, subjected to unimaginable cruelty, and forced into labor under the most horrific conditions. The life expectancy on a sugar plantation was terrifyingly short. Jamaica wasn't just the empire's cash cow, it was its crucible of suffering. This stark contradiction, unprecedented wealth built upon systemic brutality, became the empire's great moral crisis. The very foundation of its prosperity was a deep, indefensible sin. But the story of Jamaica is not just one of victimhood, it is one of relentless resistance. From the moment they arrived, the enslaved people of Jamaica fought back. They established maroon communities in the rugged mountains, creating free societies that defied colonial rule for generations. They staged countless uprisings, culminating in massive events like the Baptist War led by Sam Sharp in 1831. This rebellion, which involved up to 60,000 enslaved people, was a turning point. It made the system of slavery untenable and was a major catalyst for the Abolition Act passed by the British Parliament just 2 years later. It was Jamaican resistance that forced the empire to look in the mirror and confront the hypocrisy of celebrating its own freedom while enslaving others. Even after emancipation, Jamaica's journey was one of forging its own identity against the backdrop of colonial power. The struggle for rights continued through labor movements in the 1930s and ultimately led to independence in 1962. From the ashes of the plantation system, something new and powerful was born. A culture that has influenced the entire world. Think of reggae music, a sound of protest and hope born from the ghettos of Trenchtown. Think of Bob Marley, whose lyrics carried a message of liberation to every corner of the globe. Think of the Rastafari movement, a spiritual and political response to colonial oppression. Jamaica didn't just break free. It created a global cultural language of freedom. So, Jamaica was never just a peripheral piece of the empire. It was its economic engine, its moral battleground, and a source of the resistance that would help dismantle the colonial system. It reflects the empire's story in its entirety, the greed, the cruelty, but also the inevitable, powerful rise of the human spirit. The next time you hear the phrase, "the sun never set on the British Empire," remember Jamaica. Because on this island, the sun didn't just set on colonial rule. A new dawn of freedom, identity, and global influence rose in its place. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. If you believe there are more hidden stories in the chapters of our past, please subscribe to Historomystic and hit that notification bell. We're always digging deeper, because every empire leaves a mystery behind. See you next time.